All right. Do you see my screen now?
Yes.
All right, cool. I think we can get started. Hi, all. First of all, thanks for inviting me to present in this forum. I think AiTech is a great match for the several things that I do, and it's a pleasure to be presenting here. Lucian already mentioned, so I'm Pradeep Murukannaiah. I'm an assistant professor in interactive intelligence. So I also co-direct Hippo Lab. So this is a new Delft AI lab. It's a bridge between computer science and TPM, broadly on the theme of using AI for public policy design and analysis. So we're currently in the state of hiring PhD students, and of course we're looking forward to build the lab. And happy to talk to any of you with respect to what we do, and looking for collaborations there. Yeah, so with that said, I guess we can just dive deep into it. What did we do here? Yeah. So broadly, the outline for talk today is, I want to introduce the notion of AI ethics from our standpoint. So it's from the standpoint of socio-technical systems. And then I'll describe what we mean by socio-technical systems and why our view of socio-technical systems is important for realizing ethics in technical systems. And then I'll talk about particularly about values and norms. So those are two ingredients of ethical socio-technical systems. And then I'll end with some broader challenges and immediate opportunities to advance this topic. So that's broadly the outline. Okay, so let's start with a very fundamental question. So what is ethics? So if you think about it, you may read several definitions, but at the end of the day, the core of it is about distinguishing right versus wrong behavior, right? So that's what's at the core of ethics. This may make it sound like this is purely like an individual's trait, like being ethical. But if you think about it, even in the classical foundations of ethics, an individual's behavior is not purely individual. It's shaped by others around the individual. So things like family and friends, which expands into the broader society. So that's what it means is whenever we want to study ethics, it's important that we try to understand one's behavior with respect to others. And this is also evident when you look at several ethical dilemmas. So ethical dilemmas are basically situations where there are no obviously good choices. So you can start by looking at classic trolley problems, somewhat overstudied in my opinion. So there's always like these scenarios where these hypothetical scenarios where the trolley can go in like one track or the other track, like kill 10% versus like 10 people versus like one child, and all these kinds of situations, right? Like what is the best thing for the trolley to do, ethically speaking? You can also look at other scenarios, like for example, if you think of Les Miserables. So the main character, so he steals a loaf of bread. Of course, stealing is bad, like ethically speaking, but at the same time, Jean Valjean, he stole the piece of or the loaf of bread to feed a child, right? So then is stealing really a bad thing because that was with a good cause? And again, you don't have to think of like the hypothetical scenarios, right? So you can also think of, like, for example, think of like an ambulance that is speeding to the hospital. So what is the extent to which it can speed? On the one hand, the faster it goes, the higher the chances of saving the patient in the ambulance. But at the same time, if it goes too fast, then there is the higher likelihood of accidents and also harming others. So like then considering these things, what is ethically speaking the right amount of speed at which the ambulance should travel? I also want to highlight that ethics is not only, or the ethical dilemmas are not only about these hypothetical or extreme, like life and death type of scenarios. So ethical dilemmas arise also in very mundane day-to-day type of scenarios. For example, think about one answering a phone in a meeting, right? So like a meeting like this one. So you're in a meeting. Let's say it's more appropriate if it was like a real physical meeting. So can one take a phone call in between the meeting? It doesn't have to be the presenter. It can also be the people in the audience, as it often happens. Well, on the one hand, actually, it's a bad thing to do. So it disrupts the meeting and it also affects other people who are taking their time to be in the meeting. But at the same time, the person that is calling you, maybe let's say that's one of your friends who is in some sort of an accident and need your help. And of course, at that stage, actually taking that phone call, phone call, it does help the your friend. So it can be justified from that perspective. You can take it even further, right? So once you take a call, so you have an option. So if you don't do anything, then other people will think that you are rude, or you probably want to tell other people that you took a call, if not right now, later, that you took the call because somebody needed your help and that was important, so that you can avoid sanctions from these other people. But I mean, is that okay now, considering that you violated the privacy of the person? You said that actually your friend was in an accident, and telling that to other people creates an impression that your friend was a bad driver. So, I mean, if you start thinking about these things, like ethical dilemmas, they arise in like several scenarios in like day-to-day type of activities as well. So broadly, what we're interested in is like, I mean, if agents were to be, or like if AI was to be in this decision-making process, how can it understand these scenarios and help make decisions? So one thing that you may have noticed in all these examples is that all of these are inherently multi-agent settings. So in the trolley problems, you always have a decision like considering one person or the other person. Similarly, with the speeding hospital, I said that there's a patient in the ambulance, and then there's other people who may get harmed if you go too fast. Answering a phone, then I think the people in a meeting, and then there's this other person who was calling you. So in almost all scenarios, whenever we talk about ethics, there's always like multiple parties involved, and the decision is always about what is right or wrong, considering this multi-agent setting as a whole. Um, However, the dominant view of, or the large majority of works that you see in literature today, like I'm talking about computer science literature, are typically about making one agent or one algorithm ethical. So I see that at least there are three like major problems in this view. So the first problem is that I mean, ethics is not really about the technical entity, right? So I mean, what does it really mean to say that actually, like let's say accountability as the ethical property, to say that actually the software is accountable, right? So in almost all cases, there's always like a principle behind this technical entity, which is a social actor, and the ethical burden lies on the principle. So if your autonomous car were to be in an accident, I mean, what does it really mean to hold the car accountable? I mean, it could be the company who manufactured the car, or it could be the person who owns the car, but the accountability always is with the principle behind the technology. So that's the first problem. So trying to make the algorithm itself or the machine itself ethical without thinking about the broader social context in which the machine is operating. So the second problem is thinking that you can make one entity like the car on its own, or the algorithm on its own ethical. Like consider, for example, an application that makes recommendations about mortgage in a bank. So broadly, let's say the bank aspires to be fair in making its mortgage decisions, and that's why there's I mean in the machine learning literature, especially in the last decade or so, there have been several algorithms, metrics, and measures for making the algorithm itself ostensibly fair. So why do I say ostensibly fair? Because actually there have been several studies that, especially recently, that show that I mean, none of these algorithms in a long run yield equitable outcomes to all participants. So, I mean, you may adjust the gradients of the algorithm a certain way, or tweak the parameters of the algorithm a certain way, but often actually it happens that actually the unfairness is because let's say the machine is being trained on data from previous bank managers who made lending decisions. If those managers were unfair in how they made the decisions, and if that is the data on which your mortgage algorithm is trained, then obviously the best the algorithm can learn is these biased decisions that the previous managers made. And again, it's not just like one algorithm, right? So the whole, let's say, the mortgage process. I mean, there is like a mortgage recommendation. I don't know. There is like an audit department, or maybe there is some document processing department. I mean, all of them need to make certain decisions eventually to make sure that the decision is fair. And focusing purely on making an individual algorithm fair, that doesn't solve the problem, especially in the longer run. So what we need, like I said, is you want to think of software systems in general as broadly situated in a society of stakeholders. And ethical considerations really arise in how the social actors or the stakeholders interact with each other. And our goal is to design these systems in such a way. Again, it becomes like a difficult problem, so I'll show you in a bit. So design these systems in such a way, not in an atomistic manner, trying to make only like a part of it fair, but the system as a whole fair. So that's the broader objective of what we have been doing. So you can push it one more step further. So I mean, you can think of as a software, like in the previous slide, as decision support systems. But I think more futuristically, you can also think of these software systems as agents that act and interact on behalf of stakeholders. In that they also make several proactive decisions. So so then I think the question really is, I mean, we're thinking of this AI system. It's no more like a single algorithm, no more like a box of computer, but it's a broader multi-agent system, which is like a micro society. I'm saying a micro society because like within the larger human society, you can have several multi-agent systems depending on the application scenario. Each of them is a micro system, and the agents in this micro society, they reflect the autonomy of its stakeholders. And it's important to note that, I mean, I think I mentioned it in one of the slides before, autonomy and automation are not to be confused. I mean, often actually when people say autonomy, they mean automations, like more and more things are done in an automated manner. But that doesn't really mean that the software or the principle is flexible to do whatever it wants to do. And that's what autonomy is all about. And of course, autonomy and accountability, so they mirror each other. So one is only autonomous to the extent to which they're accountable for whatever they are free to do. I mean, if you want to understand concepts like this and model concepts like this, the essential argument is that you want to think of systems as multi-agent systems, or broadly like what I'll show in the next slide as socio-technical systems. Otherwise, whatever ethical outcomes or ethical properties that you may realize in technology would be fairly shallow, in my opinion. So just to, okay, maybe I think I'll just take a bit of a small break here to see how you're doing and if there are any questions so far. Is there anything on chats, Luciano? I cannot really see the chat screen.
No, there's not in the chat, but does someone have any questions? Please just speak up or raise your hand. Do we have any questions? I guess that everything is very clear so far. I do have some questions, but I'll keep them for the end then.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's keep going then.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so I wanted to take, I wanted to describe our vision of what a socio-technical system is in a little more detail. Like I said, whenever you want to think of like engineering an AI system, it's our strong argument that you want to think of like engineering it as a broader socio-technical system, which has both the social tier, so the principles are when I say principle, I mean like humans and organizations. So they interact in the social tier, and many of the ethical challenges arise in the social tier. What we also want is a technical tier where agents can represent the principles, and of course the agent's behavior affects the principle. And there is one additional layer to it. It's not about like also engineering the individual agents. What you also want is you want a specification or a model of a socio-technical system that can govern the interaction between these individual agents. And one other point that I forgot to mention earlier is also that what's important is that you want to think of these socio-technical systems as decentralized multi-agent systems. Actually, even in the multi-agent systems community, there have been quite a few works which confuse like distribution with decentralization. I mean, the fact that let's say each of us, so I talked about like let's say you're using an app for managing your the ringer on your phone, or any other app for that matter. The fact that each of us have a different app installed on our computer, that in itself doesn't make it decentralized. So if all of these apps are essentially talking to like a centralized server, like Google or Apple or whatever that's sitting somewhere, I mean, conceptually, this is as bad as like a centralized system that's like a client server system, everybody talking to one server. Now, when we say decentralized, what we really mean is that each agent has its own control, and the corresponding principal is the control for that agent. And of course, you will still need some centralized entities to realize this broader system as a whole, but you don't really need this centralized system for governing the system. So each agents can enact their part of the broader protocol, like we say, to realize the socio-technical system as a whole. Yeah. Yeah, and then like I was saying, when we say STS, again, it's not really like a separate running system. So it's not like you engineer a system and then you put that system on a set of computers and it runs it. So the idea is that you engineer individual agents and you specify the broader socio-technical system as a whole. And this, when these agents are put to use, actually their interaction is what makes up the socio-technical system. So like we say, in a setting like this, you want your, like whenever the agent wants to make an ethical decision, you need to have a user model to understand what are the values and preferences of the user. You also want some aspects that are at a societal level or at a social level, things like norms and sanctions, because these are expectations from others. And then you also need some technical capability, like reasoning about the context and what actions to take and things like that. All of this have to go into the decision model of the agent. So the broader technical challenge then is how can we engineer such a decentralized multi-agent system? So like I was saying, you need both. So on the one hand, you want to model the individual agents, and some things can be modeled at the agent level. Like for example, the values of the individual users and their value preferences, they can be learned at an individual level. But these will influence what norms you want to use for specifying the socio-technical system as a whole. So the norms must be modeled then at the level of socio-technical systems. And again, once you have a set of norms in place, actually they can influence the values of the system. So it's a process that goes hand in hand. So the agents, like on the one hand, to specify the socio-technical system, the stakeholders have to come together and negotiate with each other in order to come up with whatever are the appropriate norms of the system. And when you develop the reasoning for the individual agent, then that takes into account the values as well as norms that were specified at the socio-technical system. And then, so this relates also to the ethical properties that you desire, like things like fairness, transparency, and accountability, like here. So know that actually each of these concepts, actually you can think of them at the socio-technical system, then you can also mirror them and think about it like a projection of that at the individual agent level. And this goes all the way from like designing and developing the agent to like verification and validation. For example, if you want to verify the individual agent, you can verify that with respect to norms of the socio-technical system. So that was specified at the level of STS. And if you want to validate the STS, then you can do with the values of the individual members of the system. So in essence, what I want to convey from this picture is that this development of individual agents and specifying the socio-technical system as a whole, I mean, that has to go hand in hand. It doesn't mean that you have to do it one shot. I mean, so this is going to be an iterative process, like I'll show you in a bit. And then you start with certain version. So you may start with certain like values and design your individual agents. Then you would notice once the agents are put to use that the agents are repeatedly getting sanctions for violating some norms. So that means that actually either there is a problem in the way the agent models the values, or there could also be a problem in the way norms are put together in the place. And so one of them requires changes to it. So in a sense, so what we have been doing like for like at least like 7-8 years now is developing broadly a methodology for specifying the socio-technical system and the agents that operate within that socio-technical system. At a very high level, so the way it works is you start by identifying the individual stakeholders' value preferences, and then you can specify norms that support those value preferences. And of course, you would refine the norms as we go. And norms are what are crucial for accountability. When things don't go as expected, then you can see who you can hold account for using the norms in the system. And then the individual agents, I mean, they take one or more roles in the STS as a whole, and they carry out their part of the enactment. So each agent has to carry out its part of the enactment, and the enactment itself is enforced decentrally. There is no one central entity that enforces this enactment. Now, when you have a system like this, then you could evaluate the outcomes of the system with respect to the values promoted or the norm satisfied and things like that. And then you iterate this process over the period of the STS. Of course, it's a fairly abstract method as a whole, and it seems like easy enough when you look at the whole methodology. But of course, realizing each and every part of it is like a challenge on its own. So what we have been doing is like we're developing like a suite of methods. Some of these are more methodological, some are more technical. In realizing this broader overview of how you specify an STS and how do you specify individual agents in that STS. So we've been working on, like, for example, the most recent work here is about identifying contextually relevant values. And then we did some earlier work which shows how you can incorporate values in agent-oriented models. And you can also use both values and norms for reasoning about what actions to take. We also did work on how communicating values, how can agents communicate their values with each other so as to receive positive sanctions, not negative sanctions. And then, of course, there are going to be conflicts in a system like this. So how can you identify those conflicts and resolve those conflicts? So I'm not going to, of course, talk about all these works in this presentation, but just to give a flavor of what we're doing, I'll talk about values and what we're doing with values, especially the recent work. And then I'll talk about how values can be used to inform norms of the system. Okay. I'm just taking a bit of a pause to see if there's any comments.
Yeah, we have a question here from Evgeny about a figure you showed early on about that you divide the sociotechnical system, the human agent duo, and there is some, I believe he refers to that one. Evgeny, do you wanna, should I read it or do you wanna comment on it?
So thanks for
cool. Thank you.
Hi Pradeep. Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation so far. So it's about an earlier figure you showed, where you showed how. I think it was here. Yeah. So how norms, values get goals. Yeah, value preferences get realized in different parts of the system. So if I understand correctly, you show that norms and values are realized in technical parts of the system, while the social side of the system regulates. But I would say that a sociotechnical design approach requires us to realize values and norms in both social and technical aspects. So it's as much about designing interaction between humans through organizational practices, social infrastructure, as it is about designing interaction between humans and technical artifacts. So it's the synthesis of all of these together, the humans and the technical aspects, that gives the sociotechnical system its emergent desired properties. Would you agree? So
sure.
Designing the social infrastructure and the technical infrastructure as part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm not sure which aspect of it where I conveyed. I think I fully agree with what you're saying, and that's exactly what I want to convey as well. So the distinction between say the social and the technical tier is more like so social tier is where like humans operate, and technical tier is where the agents or robots or whatever they operate. And of course, the real challenge is taking some of these abstractions that the principles used in the social tier, and coming up with technical abstractions that can be realized in technical entities. I mean, that's what specifying the socio-technical system is all about, in my opinion. And of course, it's not easy.
Yeah, I think so. So thanks for clarifying. So because when I looked at the figure, I saw that so the green lines that you have, they show that the realization happens in the technical tier, but I see to the social tier, I see the regulate line. So then I just wanted to check with you, because like basically what I'm saying, I would extend also the realization, where we implement the norms. It's as much about the social tier as it is about the tech, and to them together interacting with each other.
Yeah, so what we mean here is, of course, if you're thinking about even broader issues, like for example, like things like laws and so on. Then of course some of these norms and so on, they need to be realized in the social tier as well. So that's like definitely like a dimension there. But at least here what I want to convey is that I mean, we're really interested in how can you realize the social abstractions in the technical tier. I mean, that's why you're saying the realized in for the technical tier and the regulate for the social tier, because this is something that we're not asking principles on how to behave. I mean, of course, that's again this another domain, like for example the policies and things like that. So they may work on that, but at least the scope here is that I mean, you're not trying to like come up with like rules for how humans or organizations should behave, assuming that they are behaving a certain way based on whatever is the framework. How can you sort of like translate that to the technical tier? That was the focus here.
Well, so just, well, I don't want to delay it for it, but no, so my point is basically I'm saying that we should be thinking about designing them jointly together. So basically, to your point that you mentioned early in the presentation, like with fairness, right? You said that it doesn't make much sense to, if you try to avoid discrimination, to focus just on the algorithm, that you need to think about the larger practices which are around it, right? So because all of it interacts together, basically I'm saying like that requires basically designing it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's indeed the right intuition. I think I agree that you cannot like, I mean, just like if you want to make any rules about like how like I don't know, the humans in a smart car should behave, then that has to go hand in hand with the rest of it. I think that's what you're saying. So not only about you should have to come up with norms for how smart cars should behave, but also about norms about how humans in those smart cars should behave. Yeah, I agree. I think that's the right intuition, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, it's good. Thanks.
Nice discussions. Do you have any other questions right now? I think for now you can, go ahead, Pradeep. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll keep going. Yeah, so like I said, how are we doing on time?
Now is 3:32, so we will have some time.
Yeah, so basically what I'll do is, so especially this part of the presentation, I think I'm going to talk about a few of our papers at like some more concrete details. I will go through it fast, but of course, if you want more details, please feel free to ask me as I speak. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about values. And why are we even talking about values? I mean, what are values to start with? So essentially, values, when you think of values, as Schwartz says, we think of what is important to us in life. And then why are we talking about values? Because if you want to make any ethical decision, you need some building blocks to be able to reason about what's right and what's wrong. And values are one such building blocks for reasoning about ethics. Schwartz describes here all values have like he characterizes like 6 main features. So these are priorities that guide actions. I think that's important from a technical perspective, because you want to eventually use values in making decisions. And these are beliefs that are intrinsically linked to affect. So it's all related to affect. So I don't want to go there. This also refer to goals. So it's like each of them has a clear motivational goal. And values also transcend context. So it's not something that is applicable in only one particular scenario, but they can be applied in a variety of different scenarios. And of course, this is challenging, right? So that depends on the abstraction at which we are looking at values. And I'll talk more about this transcending context aspect in a bit. And there are also the standards criteria. And that's how you could justify the rightness or wrongness of one's action based on what values they hold, especially when there is no obviously right or wrong answer. And they can be ordered by importance. So that's what distinguishes one person from the other, although the values are universal and all values are applicable to all people. And how you ascribe relative importance among these values changes from person to person, and that's what makes these preferences also subjective. Just a bit on like a motivation as to like why these are universally applicable. So in essence, humans as social beings, all of us have like several basic requirements. So I mean, you can look at the Maslow's pyramid, so which range all the way from biological and physiological requirements, as well as requirements of the social requirements like love and belongingness. and all the way to like more about self-actualization and more individual type of requirements. In several of these, in pursuit of several of these values, what you need is cooperation of other people. And essentially, then what you need is a language to communicate your needs with other people, and that's how. And values are that language. So you can use values to express to other people why you want do something a certain way, and then they may be interested in cooperating with you as well. So that's a bit of a motivation about like what values are and why they are universal. But the question is still, can you use values in like decision-making contexts as is? Like for example, what I show here is 10 values that Schwartz identifies in his model. So they're on 2 dimension. So some of these values are more self-centered, so achievement and power, and the others are more about other-centered, things like universalism and benevolence. And of course, you will have preferences among these. Like I mean, each person will have preferences among these. And the other dimension is some values are more about conserving the past or the tradition, and the other values are more about openness to change, right? So there's 10 values are along these 2 dimensions. But the question is like how can you use these values in like engineering specific apps? Like for example, I mean, we had a scenario some time ago. Let's say you're trying to develop an app in this pandemic times. So you want to build an app that would recommend you when to go out and when to not go out, right? So depending on, I mean, whatever factors, the crowding or the infection rate, I mean, whatever it may be. I mean, can you just take values like the ones that I show here and engineer an app like that? And it turns out that that's not trivial. So firstly, these values are, I mean, not all of these values will be applicable in the particular context that I'm talking about. And again, how you interpret these values could be quite different from one context to other context. So what we have been doing, what we did recently is we developed a methodology for coming up with values that are specific to a particular context. So they're applicable in that context. At the same time, they have an interpretation that is specific to that context. So this is a hybrid methodology. So this is where I think some of our HI techniques also come into picture. I mean, you have humans identifying these values at the same time. Automated techniques, in this case, natural language processing in particular, is assisting the annotators in coming up with these values. It's not like some designer thought that these are the values that are applicable in this context on their own. So this is more of a data-driven approach. And where do we get data for doing things like this? We look at discourse. Like for example, for COVID-related values, you can look at like what people are talking about COVID and what they like and what they don't like. So this is like, for example, like a Reddit discussion about protests about lockdown measures. And you could, so once you start once an annotator start looking at discourse like this, then they can identify what values may be relevant to users in this context or not. I won't get into the details of the method, but again, you don't have to. This doesn't have to be Reddit data, right? So we actually did it with data from a large-scale survey that was conducted at TPM by Nick Mouter. So it's called a participatory value evaluation. But you can also use, like for example, like for specific, like let's say for mobile apps, you can also look at their application reviews to see what kinds of things users value in that application and things like that. And this all gives data for you to identify values that are relevant in a particular context. And we also did some experiments to show that so the methodology that we had yields values that are, I mean, first of all, specific to this context. I mean, if you identify values in a different context, then you're going to get like a different set of values, not the same. And also the methodology is repeatable in the sense that it's not specific to people who apply it. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it afterwards. So once you know what are the values that are in play in a particular scenario, you also want some mechanisms to incorporate these values in the model of an agent, right? So coming up with like a list of values, maybe that's fine for like a policymaker to look at it and say what to do in a particular scenario. But if you really want like agents to make decisions from like abstractions like values, you want some technical abstractions to incorporate these values into the design and also the eventually the source code of the agent. So I think for that, I think there is quite a bit of work in the multi-agent systems community broadly about agent-oriented software engineering, which has these high-level abstractions, things like actors, goals, plans, beliefs, and dependencies. And as we noted earlier, so values essentially refer to goals, and you can incorporate values in an agent model directly using goals. You remember I talked about this intelligent ringer application. So essentially, this application is trying to decide whether to ring your phone silent or like loud or vibrate. It automatically does that depending on whatever it thinks is ethically appropriate. Like if you think of that scenario, I think there'll be like values like privacy that are important, and you don't want to disturb others. That's a value. And you also want to be reachable by people, and these are the values that are specific to this context. First, that can be identified using axis, the methodology that I described earlier, and then using the other methods that we have described, you can incorporate them as part of your agent model. I mean, note that when I talk about these agent models, these are not just figures, right? So these are formal models, so they can be computationally represented, and they can even be refined to such an extent that eventually they can be traced to the actual code of the agent. So there are two advantages of models like that. So one, it makes the reasoning process of the designer explicit, which we have shown in some experiments that when somebody else has to maintain your application, they better understand why a certain thing was done a certain way, looking at these agent models. And the other advantage is also from the end user's perspective. Like for example, I mean, you know what are the values that are under play in a particular context, but you still want to know like what values one user prefers over another value. So it's the value preferences which is user specific. And if you want to elicit that, I mean, instead of giving like a flat surveys to users and asking them what they value more, you can start asking these questions in particular contexts. So these models will have like placeholders where you could say, so this is something that I know that actually, like for example, in this case, so deciding whether somebody wants to whether they value to be reachable by phone more or to work interrupted by phone more, you need to ask question there. And we're saying that depends on the relationship to the caller and whatever is the context of the neighbors. And then you can ask this question to the user in this particular context. So essentially, you have a model like this, and that's realized as the software agent, and the software agent is put to use whenever this context is recognized. That's the time at which the software would ask this particular question to the user. And again, I think there are some more details here in how you ask that, like in specifically you use active learning for doing that. So this way you could also combine the more of the symbolic approach, which is this is the symbolic approach, and then actual learning of this context is more from a machine learning perspective. You learn that from the data. You can combine both the learning and the symbolic approaches in doing things like that. So that's a bit about values. And then I want to slowly transition to also the notion of norms. So values are fine. So if you want, like I said, you can develop individual agents that can make decisions for the individual user. So you can do it based on what values a particular action promotes and what values an individual action demotes, and then you can come up with a balance. But it's more complicated than that, because a lot of the times it's not just values that influence action, but it's also the expectations of other people. Like for example, in this case, think, let's say we are talking about an app which is like a location sharing app. So the app automatically shares your location with the other people, and who it shares with, when it shares with, depends on whatever is ethically appropriate. And of course, you can, so like let's say Frank is the user who is using this app. He prefers pleasure and recognition as values. So the app can share his location whenever it thinks that it is promoting these values. But it's possible, let's say that his mother Grace. So let's say Frank is a teenager. She cares for Frank's safety. So then I think it's in her interest also that Frank shares his location whenever. So even when these values are not promoted, probably Grace wants his location to be shared. Similarly, let's say like Frank is visiting his aunt Hope, but again, Hope prefers privacy. So the Frank's action to share with all promotes pleasure for him, but I mean the fact that he is with the Hope, if he shares his location, that's also sharing Hope's location. That violates Hope's privacy. So then, how can you make decisions like ethical decisions in this case? The values that the individuals care for in itself is not sufficient. We also want to know what are the expectations of other people about your behavior, and that's where norms come into picture. So in essence, a norm, again, I'm using it as in the word norm in a technical sense. So it's a directed social expectation between principals. So although there can be like a variety of expectations, so we can like many common interactions, we can imagine that these expectations can be thought of as like very few different forms, like things like commitments, prohibition, authorization, and power. In that setting, essentially, you would say for in each norm, it says what is the subject and what's the object and what's the antecedent and what's the consequent. So that's essentially like the core of the norm. So it says that like, for example, for a commitment, it says like the subject is committed to the object. When the antecedent holds, it will make sure that the consequent will come into picture. So again, there are two obvious advantages of using norms. One is it makes the expectations explicit. So whenever something doesn't happen, you exactly know who is accountable for that action. And the other advantage is that you don't need to invent them for each and every individual application. So you can specify the norms for the application, but you don't need to implement them in every single agent. You can have like a norm machine or like a library that like verifies norms or enacts them. At the same library, like things like a middleware can be used in all different agents. So individual agents will have different norms, but the actual realization of that individual agents don't need to do that. Can be done in something that is shared across agents. Again, I'll go through that a bit fast. So I also have an example. It's about like showing some examples of norms in a healthcare setting. I will skip through these things, but I would like to mention that again, these are not set in stone. Like a designer will specify norms to start with, but once the system is like starts operating, the norms can start. We can start like refining the norms. Like for example, here to start with, like this is a healthcare socio-technical system, there was a prohibition which said that. So the hospital prohibits physicians from sharing the personal information of the patient like outside the hospital in all circumstances. So that was the original norm. And then later you realize that, let's say there is like an emergency and your hospital is overcrowded, and there are like let's say other doctors which are from outside the hospital who are volunteering in your hospital to help deal with the overcrowding. At that stage, like I mean, you know that actually the norm will be violated, but that's okay. Norms are meant to be violated, unlike like rigid rules. And if it's like broken more than once, you know that actually there is something wrong, and then you can refine the norm. Now we can say that unless this is an emergency, the hospital prohibits the physician from sharing the PHI outside the physicians of the hospital. So that's the general idea here. And again, I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip this. So what this leads to is like a fairly complex system. So you have like individuals' values and you have norms of the system, and also these are evolving over time. And you need some mechanisms to reason about these things automatically. And one of the methods that we developed uses multi-criteria decision making. So is the method called Viker. So given all the stakeholders that are involved in a particular decision context, knowing their value preferences and knowing their norms, so you can come up with, and again, you need to use some theory. Again, this is where I think how the technical artifacts can benefit from research in more humanities disciplines. Like the utilitarianism and egalitarianism, there are like known ethical sort of stances in the literature, and then you could realize them as part of this reasoning framework. Okay, so with that said, I want to go to the last part, and I think this quickly I want to run through this. So essentially, I want to conclude by saying that so what I did so far, I introduced this notion of socio-technical system, and then I argued that in order to reason about ethics, you cannot think of like purely technically designing one algorithm or one machine. You want to think about engineering the socio-technical system as a whole. And then again, socio-technical system is like not one running entity or like one computational entity that you would engineer. You want to engineer individual agents in the system, and you want to engineer them such a way that when they are put together to use in a society, and the entire socio-technical system is realized. And for that, besides engineering the individual agents, you also want to come up with a specification for the socio-technical system as a whole. So what are some so I recognize that there are three broad categories of challenges in realizing this vision as a whole. I mean, we have been doing quite a bit of work, but it's like such a complicated problem that I can imagine spending rest of my career and I don't know, several other people spending their careers on realizing this vision fully. So the first set of challenges are about modeling ethics. So I talked about norms and values, but if you start thinking about it, one user, he or she would participate in multiple socio-technical system. And within the socio-technical system, there are multiple contexts, and then the value preferences and the norms will change depending on the settings and so on. So if you want the individuals to deal with each and every of these scenarios independently, I mean, that is just like too much information overload. So what we still need is we need some ways of abstracting this to a higher level. So like, for example, one thing that we've been thinking is, can we take these things like the behavioral pattern within socio-technical system and start formulating some ethical postures. So if you know that actually this user like acts in like one of these 10 ethical postures, and if you know which is the like which ethical posture is appropriate in which application and the context combined, and then the users have to deal with these 10 postures and refining and updating those 10 postures, and not deal with each and every decision point in each application. Yeah, so and there are again more challenges here, right? So I only talked about values and norms, but there are several other concepts that need to be formally modeled and defined, things like guilt and consent and inequity aversion and things like that. And also about like formulating pro-sociality in terms of the principles of justice. I would say, I mean, these have been studied in the humanities literature, like the philosophical literature or the psychological literature. But what we really need is, as like computer scientists, we want technical abstractions to represent these things and realize them as part of socio-technical systems. That, to a large extent, is still missing in computer science. And then we also need techniques for analyzing the ethicality of the system. So you model the system a certain way, and then once the system is put to use, you want to see to what extent the system is ethical. And again, you could think of doing this both from a design time perspective, where you could extend some of the formal verification or the model checking type of methods, but you can also do it in runtime by simulating the behavior, because I think many of these things it would be really difficult to test in the wild. And I think there are also some really good opportunities in combining this design time verification type of approaches with runtime simulation type of approaches. So finally, I already alluded to it a bit. So I mean, designers need to model the system, and then also need to, like, users and designers, they need to verify or validate the system once it puts to use. But in the process, you also have the end users. So many of these things, the values or the norms of the system, they must be elicited from the end users. So, and you want to do it unobtrusively or unintrusively. So you don't want to ask users too many questions. Because then, I mean, those solutions may not work, but you still want to give enough flexibility that people who want to specify can specify, and others can use fixed defaults of the system. But how do you do it in like a balanced way? I think that's a challenge. So one challenge is at the level of individual users, and the other is also at the level of the STS as a whole, and developing deliberation and negotiation type of techniques for coming up with norms that everybody agree to. Yeah, so with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thanks for your attention. I think we gave like a longer tutorial. I believe it was about 2.5 hours recently at AMAS. So if you want to listen to it more, or if you want to get more resources, please go to this website. So there's longer description, but I'm happy to talk more now and take some questions. Yeah, sorry, I think it took longer than I expected, but some time to ask questions.
Okay, great, Pradeep. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. A lot of course, as you yourself mentioned, a lot of research challenges, a lot of things to work on, but I can see a lot of great framework you were developed so far. So we have a first question here from Derek. Derek, should I read it, or would you like to ask it yourself?
Sure, with some compliments. I thought it was a great presentation, a lot of really good material and very specific. So thanks for sharing.
Thanks.
I guess the two questions here are, and I may have misunderstood, but it seems like a lot of this is for kind of initial system design, but I'm trying to understand this in the context of feedback loops and a kind of continuous iteration over time. Mm-hmm. Are there barriers to that, or are we missing kind of any tools or frameworks for applying this to systems iteratively?
Yeah, no, I think there are. That's a great question, and I think also like a main challenge, I would say. So I mean, there are two types of like feedback loops here, right? So one is, I think, among developers, I guess. So I mean, you develop one version of the app today, and that needs to be refined afterwards. So then you need to communicate actually what was intended by the first developer to the second developer. There is that, and that's to some extent, I think the software engineering community is focused on that. But the other feedback loop is also between like the designers. I think it goes beyond like designers. It could also be like regulators and things like that, to the actual stakeholders or the end users of the system. And that's something that we have been trying to sort of at least make an initial attempt at bridging. So like the designer comes up with an initial specification of the system and says like within the design, what are the points at which we want the end user feedback. Like for example, as a designer, I can say that actually these two values are in play in this setting, but I like which value is more important for one user or the other user. Those are the ones that the end user is supposed to say. So the fact that you can put that as part of your app, actually then the app knows, the app being intelligent is what I mean, it knows when to ask the user that question. So it can ask that question in context. Also creating these feedback loops between the designers and the end users is important. And there are also these other challenges, right? Like for example, I also did some work in the requirements engineering community. So there are more like passive feedback loops there. Like somebody uses an app and then writes a review about that application or discusses about that application in some forum. And we can also mine forums like that to understand what the users want and then update the designs accordingly. But yeah, but overall, I think it's like a fascinating challenge, and I don't think. I mean, I do think that there's quite a bit of work to be done here.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Derek. We have another question now from Evgeny. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Luciano. Pradeep, so my question is about studying values and eliciting preferences. So at the design stage, I mean, so for those of us who come from computer science, the technical side of things, who are the other experts, you would say, that need to be at the table with us in order to, at design stage, study people's values, people's needs, interpretations? Like, for example, do we need to work together with UI designers, UX designers in order to do that? And also, do you think it's necessary to, well, depending on the context, use qualitatively rich methods to do that? For example, interviews, methods from ethnography, and so forth.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, indeed, I think that's a good question. I mean, to start with, I think so the first sort of a criteria I would say for anybody who wants to be part of this process is an understanding of what values mean. But I think that's, I assume, is something that's doable. I mean, people can educate themselves on that. But the other part of your question, I think that relates to what they call as value sources in value sensitive design. I mean, that's certainly, I think you need like a mix of people, right? So on the one hand, the value sources can be, I mean, I would say the most important thing is the actual end users of the technology. If not all of them, I think you definitely need a representation of those users to be part of this like value specification or value preference elicitation process. And some of these values, I think they also come from designers and developers. So although people may want to be objective, I think there'll be all kinds of unconscious biases, and so the designers' values may eventually like surface in the applications. You also want, of course, them to be the part of this value specification process at design time. And then there was one other value sources that I think I'm missing. Yeah, but I mean, things like, I mean, this again, maybe the same category as developers and designers, but more like people who are regulators. So
I would like to add social scientists to that. So you really have great specialists in values, like Hofstede, and also Gert-Jan Hofstede is a good person to add to that, and there are more like that.
Yeah, indeed. I think so I mean, this is what I meant earlier. It's like when I said actually we want these people to be like even the other people to be like educated in values. But I think like you're saying, definitely having people who are experts in values itself, they can certainly bring other people on track if they're missing something about values.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jenny, for the question. I have also I have a quick question myself. Also, you mentioned as accountability in the framework as also connecting and respecting to norms. So I just have like but when you look also in multi-agent systems, there is also this this agent did this because of the interaction with one agent, the interaction with the other, and then you get some emergent pattern that you were not necessarily expecting. And that connects to this idea, to like this problem of many hands and many things, which like and thus diffusion of responsibility or accountability, then accountability gaps. So how do you see this in the framework by connecting accountability to norms? How can we keep track of this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's been some work that I know of. It's about delegating norms. So to start with, let's say the physician is prohibited by the hospital, and maybe that's too vague. Like what does it really mean? The hospital, right? So it may be the law division of the hospital. So I mean, I don't think it's an easy problem. But one way I can think of dealing with that in the norm setting is, I mean, you can update the subjects and objects. Of course, each time you update that, then you need to know actually what are the other norms that are related to it, and you also need to update them there. So otherwise, you would create asymmetries between. So there's one expectation here, but there's a different expectation at the other time. But all these things, I think, the advantage of doing it in a declarative way, like I said, is that each time something changes, you only need to change the specification, the declaration. You don't really need to change. Excuse me. You don't really need to change the underlying agent implementation. I think that's definitely something to like a virtue of this approach. So things will change and things will go out of control and they'll evolve over time. But each time you don't have to update the implementations of the agents. Rather, you need to just deal with the specification and update the representation or the symbols, so to say.
Yeah, great. So yeah, to have this dynamic a little bit bottom up, great. Thank you very much. So we ran out of time. So yeah, thank you very much, Pradeep. It was a really interesting talk, really nice discussions. If you have 1 or 2 more minutes, we have a final question. If that's okay for you.
Yeah, I could do that.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. Stefan, you had your hand raised. Do you still want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk. So one thing I was still wondering about is how you were handling conflicting values. So I can imagine that you don't necessarily want to go for, say, the value most people agree on, because there might be some values that are normatively more acceptable than others, so that you have some kind of ethical background theory for ranking values. So how are you treating that problem?
Yeah, no, I think that's again like in general the notion of conflicts I think is like challenging, right? So first of all, I think there can be conflicts like within one agent. So like I may have said that I prefer X to Y like one time, and I may have said the other time that I prefer Y to X. That's already like a sort of conflict, like conflict within, and that's good to realize to start with. So it's possible that. That's like a real preference. So I do mean, I think in this context, I prefer X to Y, and that context, I prefer Y to X, but that's fine. But it could also be that actually like humans being not always rational or like being bounded rational, you may have not thought it through. You may think that actually you prefer X to Y, but you really prefer Y to X in both settings. Like recognizing this is already a starting point for sort of like prompting the user to think carefully about these. That's still at the level of an individual user. Now, of course, there will be conflicts when you like, especially when you want to use norms to inform, when you want to use values to inform norms. So I may have genuinely one value preference, and the other stakeholder may have another value preference. So how can we specify like one norm where both of these stakeholders interact? So I think that's, I mean, to some extent. I mean, unavoidable, but at the same time, it's not. We don't have to force people to follow whatever is the majority. So I can still follow whatever I think is more valuable to me. I take actions like that. knowing that actually if I do that, actually these are the sanctions that I'm going to get. Like for example, like the norm is for only a physician to administer a certain drug. But it could be like a patient is dying and the doctor is not there, and the nurse knows that actually to save the patient's life, this is the drug that needs to be administered there. So even though that action was violating the norm, so if that is in accordance with the value preferences of the nurse, she may still administer that particular drug. So that would eventually then mean that actually there was something wrong with the norm, right? So that you could recognize, and then you could update the norms over time with the same motivation. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging thing. And also I think some of the other things that we're doing with respect to these negotiations, instead of like one designer manually specifying the norms of the system, like when I say one person specifying the norms, if these norms were to be specified as part of the interaction between the stakeholders, even from the very beginning during the design time, then it's likely that you know like what were the norms and why they were put together in the first place to start with. Yeah, so that's
so you
like
work
my
from the
broader
preferences up, sort of. You start with the preferences and then adjust the norms based on those.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I think we have to wrap up. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks again, Pradeep. It was very nice. And yeah, see you all soon on the next AiTech Agora.
Thank you all. I think I appreciate again for inviting me here, and I would be happy to talk to any of you more about these things or also other things that I'm interested in. Please feel free to send me an email and we can set up a meeting. Well, thanks. Bye.